Rachel took shelter with the strangers around the campfire. They were a group of hunters, huddled together for warmth and survival. They had been stranded in the wilderness as well, but they had managed to set up camp and start a fire. Rachel was grateful to have found them, but she was still afraid. She knew that the wolf could be out there, waiting for her. She also knew that the hunters might not be as trustworthy as they seemed. Rachel had heard stories of hunters who would turn on each other in times of desperation. Despite her fear, Rachel knew that she had to stay with the hunters. They were her only hope of survival in the harsh winter wilderness. She tried to make conversation with them, but they were mostly silent and stoic. They eyed her warily, as if she was an intruder in their territory. As the night wore on, the wind died down and the snow let up. Rachel was relieved to see the sky clearing, but she knew that the cold would only get worse. She huddled closer to the fire, trying to get warm. One of the hunters finally spoke up. "We're heading to a cabin in the woods," he said. "It's not far from here. We can make it there by morning if we leave now." Rachel was hesitant to go with them, but she knew that it was her only chance of survival. She agreed to go, and they set out into the darkness. The hunters led Rachel through the woods, their rifles at the ready. They were cautious and alert, scanning the trees for any signs of danger. Rachel felt safer with them, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something. As they approached the cabin, Rachel's heart sank. It was the same cabin where she had been attacked by the wolf. She tried to protest, but the hunters pushed her inside. Rachel was horrified to see the wolf's body lying in a corner of the cabin. It had been killed and skinned, its fur hanging from a hook on the wall. Rachel felt sick to her stomach. She realized that the hunters had been tracking the wolf, and they had lured her to the cabin to use her as bait. Rachel knew that she had to get out of there. She made a run for the door, but the hunters blocked her way. They were holding their rifles, and Rachel knew that she was trapped. The hunters explained that they needed food and supplies to survive the winter. They had been tracking the wolf for days, and they had finally caught it. But they needed more food, and Rachel was their only hope. Rachel tried to reason with them, but they wouldn't listen. They tied her up and left her in the cabin, promising to return soon. Rachel struggled against her bonds, trying to free herself. But it was no use. She was trapped in the cabin, with no way to escape. As the night wore on, Rachel heard strange noises outside the cabin. She heard footsteps in the snow, and she knew that the hunters had returned. But she also heard something else. It was a low growling sound, like an animal in pain. Rachel tried to ignore the sounds, but they only grew louder. She heard scratching at the door, and she knew that something was trying to get in. She realized with horror that there were other wolves out there, looking for their pack mate. Rachel struggled against her bonds, trying to break free. But it was too late. The wolves burst through the door, snarling and snapping at her. Rachel screamed and fought back, but it was no use. The wolves overwhelmed her, dragging her into the darkness. The hunters found Rachel's body the next morning, torn apart by the wolves. They knew that they had.
Alexa's heart pounded as she heard the sound of footsteps approaching the cabin. She desperately searched the room for anything she could use as a weapon, but all she could find was a fireplace poker. She grabbed it tightly and braced herself for the worst. The door burst open, and a figure dressed all in black stepped inside. Jane's first instinct was to attack, but the stranger raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "I heard you screaming and came to check on you." Jane hesitated for a moment, unsure if she could trust the stranger, but his voice sounded sincere. She lowered the poker and asked him who he was and why he was dressed like that. The man in black explained that he was a hermit who lived in the nearby woods, and he often wore black clothing to blend in with his surroundings. He had heard rumors of strange happenings in the area and had come to investigate. Jane was still on edge, but the man in black seemed genuine, and she was grateful for any company in her current situation. They talked for a while, sharing stories and trying to pass the time until the morning light. As they spoke, Jane noticed that the man in black seemed to have a calming effect on her. She felt like she could trust him, despite not knowing anything about him. Finally, the sun began to rise, and the man in black offered to walk Jane back to her car. They stepped outside, and Jane breathed a sigh of relief as she saw her vehicle in the distance. However, her relief was short-lived. As they approached the car, they heard a rustling in the bushes. Suddenly, a creature lunged out at them, and Jane screamed in terror. The man in black acted quickly, grabbing the fireplace poker and fending off the creature. They managed to escape and get into the car, speeding away from the cabin and the danger that had lurked there. As they drove, Jane couldn't help but wonder who the man in black really was and what had brought him to the woods that night. But despite her questions, she was grateful for his help and for the sense of safety he had brought her in the midst of a terrifying ordeal. Little did she know that their chance encounter would lead to an unexpected friendship and a deeper understanding of the power of kindness and compassion in the face of fear and darkness.
Jane's life became a never-ending cycle of fear and anxiety after that fateful winter night. Every shadow, every creaking floorboard, every gust of wind sent shivers down her spine. She never felt truly safe or secure, even when she moved to a new city and tried to start over. Years went by, but the memory of that winter night continued to haunt her. She tried to forget, to move on with her life, but the fear never truly went away. One winter evening, as she was walking home from work, she felt a familiar chill run down her spine. She looked around and saw a man walking towards her. He was dressed all in black, and his face was obscured by the shadows. Jane froze in terror as the man approached her. She tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The man in black came closer and closer until he was standing right in front of her. Jane could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she stared into his cold, empty eyes. He raised a hand towards her, and for a moment, she thought he was going to strike her. But instead, he handed her a small piece of paper and whispered, "Read this." Jane hesitated, but then she took the paper from his hand and read the words written on it. They were simple, but they shook her to her core. "I'm sorry." The man in black turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Jane was left standing there, shaking with fear and confusion. Over the next few weeks, Jane began to receive more letters from the man in black. They were always short and cryptic, but they all contained the same message: "I'm sorry." Jane was terrified and didn't know what to do. She started to feel like she was being watched, like someone was always lurking in the shadows. She began to see the man in black everywhere she went. One night, as she was walking home from work, Jane heard footsteps behind her. She turned around and saw the man in black walking towards her. She tried to run, but he caught up to her quickly. The man in black grabbed her by the arm and pulled her close. "I'm sorry," he whispered in her ear. Jane was paralyzed with fear as the man in black continued to speak. He told her about his own past and the demons that he had faced.
He talked about how he had found redemption and how he wanted to help others do the same. As Jane listened to him, she began to feel a sense of compassion and understanding growing inside of her. She started to see the man in black in a new light, not as a monster but as a fellow human being struggling to overcome his own demons. Over time, Jane began to trust the man in black. They started to talk regularly, and she began to see that he was genuinely sorry for what he had done. He was trying to make amends, to make things right. One day, the man in black asked Jane to meet him at a secluded cabin in the woods. She was hesitant, but she agreed to go. When she arrived at the cabin, she saw that the man in black had set up a small table with 2 chairs. He had prepared a simple meal of soup and bread, and he invited her to sit down and eat with him. As they ate, the man in black continued to talk about his past and his journey towards redemption. He talked about how he had changed, how he had found peace and happiness in his life. Jane listened intently, and for the first time, she felt like she was truly able to let go of the fear and anger that had consumed her for so long. She felt like